All right, so this is a lecture on Mesoamerica today. Now, before we get started, I wanted just to make a couple of announcements related to Ethnic Studies 37A. Please be sure that you are doing the readings. To be successful in this course, you need to not only view the lectures, but you need to be doing the readings. Particularly at this point, should be focusing a lot of attention on the book Religions of Mesoamerica by David Carrasco. Um, all right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Now, before you view this lecture, make sure you've seen the Origin Theories lecture. Um, when we introduce Mexican American history, we begin with Mesoamerica. And I want to tackle, again, the question of how do we know what we know? And the question, was there an advanced civilization in Mesoamerica before the Europeans got here? And what type of worldviews existed in Mesoamerica? Now, when I've taught this course before, I've always liked to remind students that learning about Mesoamerica, for many students, it's the first time. And sometimes it can be very overwhelming. You could get overwhelmed by the words that are indigenous words. And I want to be very, very clear. My expectation for you is not that you become experts on Mesoamerica and learn every fact and everything about all the different groups. But as we look at the major groups, is my expectation going to be that you have a general understanding of the major cultures of Mesoamerica and what their worldviews were? Absolutely. Absolutely. We'll expect for you to be able to write about Mesoamerica in terms of how they saw and understood the world around them and how it was different from Europe and the people of Europe and their way of thinking. Absolutely. All right, so with that in mind, your goal as you do the readings from Carrasco in particular are to really sort of immerse yourself and try to understand this non-European group of people called Mesoamericans. Now, as we get started, it might be helpful for us to look at a map, and so let's start by looking at a map of Mesoamerica. This map is very colorful, but let me just point out some of the major groups we'll be talking about. Okay, one of the oldest groups, the Olmec, settled in what is kind of the Gulf region and the area of what is Veracruz, Mexico today. The Mayans in this kind of olive-colored section in what is referred to as the Yucatan Peninsula. And then we'll talk a bit about the ancient city of Teotihuacan in central Mexico and the cities of Tenochtitlan, which is today basically where Mexico City is. Okay. Now, some of you may have already visited some of these areas and some of these archaeological sites, which is great. I'd be interested in hearing what your thoughts were. I've been fortunate in my lifetime to have traveled to many of these sites, and if you ever get that opportunity, I definitely encourage you to go scope it out. It's a mind-blowing experience. I've been to, let's see here, Teotihuacan, which is just outside of Mexico City. Tenochtitlan, of course, there are some archaeological sites right in the downtown area. Been to Monte Alban, which is in the Oaxacan region. We won't really talk too much about Oaxaca. And then I've been to the Yucatan. Now, a lot of people go here because the resort city of Cancun is here. So a lot of people go to Cancun and then probably go to Chichen Itza. Some of you might have done that already. I was just there this past summer and last summer. And there's a lot of sites there in the Yucatan, including Tulum, Xcaret, Uxmal. There's a lot of places out there. But Chichen Itza is really the mind-blowing place. All right, so as we talk about Mesoamerica, you might be wondering as you read Carrasco, well, how does he know? How do we actually know these ancient people and how they lived? Well, we've discussed, and that's a great question to ask, by the way. How do we know what we know, right? How do we know what we know? How does Carrasco know what he knows about Mesoamerica? And he talks about the ensemble approach, just to review what we've talked about, and he discusses sort of archaeological evidence, things that are found, right, that existed back then. Literary testimony, pictorial manuscripts, the codices, we'll talk a little bit about that, artifacts that have been dug up, oral traditions. The fact is that indigenous people have, as a huge part of their culture, storytelling, and stories get passed down. So you combine all of these things together into what's called, an ensemble, right? And then you get to sort of paint a picture of what we know about these ancient peoples. All right, so as we go forward, then we're going to be talking about the major groups, and so let's just kind of get a look at the major groups sort of in order, más o menos, more or less, because we don't have exact dates, and like we talked about in the origin theories lecture, scientists and researchers continue to push the dates further and further back, and so we're not exactly sure. Many of these groups, though, overlapped each other, and in Mexico and Central America, probably one of the oldest groups would be the Olmeca, or the Olmec culture. We'll talk about them a bit. And then we have Teotihuacan, the Maya, and a group known as the Chichimecas, kind of a fun word to say, Chichimeca, okay? And they were a large group with various subgroups, the two major subgroups that we'll talk about, the Toltecs and the Mexica. So that kind of is the major groups that existed there. Now, one thing to be aware of is that many of these groups overlapped each other and shared knowledge with each other. And so there was a lot of things that you find that they'll have in common. But because they might have lived in different geographic areas, there's also some unique characteristics associated with each of these groups, obviously. But we'll try to hone in on what are the commonalities in terms of understanding of their belief systems and so forth. And you're going to quickly find out that contrary to what many European scholars and Eurocentric textbooks have tried to make us think, indigenous people had a lot of knowledge. They weren't just, these simple Indians running around half naked in the New World with nothing to offer the world. We'll explore what knowledge they had. All right, let's see. The last of the major groups, the Mexica. You have come to know them as the Aztecs. Azteca or Aztec is the label that was given by Spanish explorer conquerors. And but in their Nahuatl language, they were known to themselves. That is, they self-identified as Mexica, and that word might look familiar to you, right? Mexica looks a lot like the word Mexico, right? And that's exactly where the name of the country comes from. It comes from this ancient people. But if you look at the timeline, right, 1521, what happens in 1521? Well, that's the Spanish conquest. So yes, the Mexica were the last of the major groups prior to European conquest, and therefore, after this lecture, we will actually get into the Mexica and spend quite a bit of time on that group. All right. And then here's just another cool, colorful timeline. How accurate it is, we can debate that, but you can look at Carrasco's book. I think he gives us a timeline as well, but that may be slightly off from what you see here. Okay, so let's start with the Olmec. The Olmeca are often thought of in Mexico as the cultura madre, or the mother culture in English. Mother culture because they gave birth to a lot of the knowledge that was then carried forward by subsequent groups. And because they're so ancient, there's a lot that we still don't know about the Olmeca. Now, that statue, that head, the colossal head you see there, that megalithic stone, you might recognize that from the previous lecture when we talked about Van Sertima and his book, They Came Before Columbus. That stone is one of several of these large carved heads that have been found in the area of what is today Veracruz, Mexico. It's made from basalt rock, which is really interesting because that type of stone only exists along the Gulf Coast. And these large stones were found several miles inland. And so it has puzzled archaeologists, like, how did they end up where they were found, They conclude that they had to have been moved, but how did they move them way back when, right? All right, some other contributions to knowledge include the development of a writing system, often referred to as hieroglyphics or picture writing, the development of the concept of zero. And those of you who've taken like the higher levels of math know that zero in mathematical calculations is very important. The Olmeca were doing it before it was being used in Europe. Okay, they developed a sophisticated calendar system that's more accurate than the one we use today. If you think about our calendar, right, every 4 years we have leap year, which is basically we're correcting a mistake in our counting of the days, right? And in February we add a day. They knew that there was 364.25 days a year, and they had a calendar system that accounted for that at that precise number. They constructed temples that we often refer to as pyramids. All right. So the Olmeca certainly are one of the ancient groups, and I wish I could tell you more, but there's a lot more questions than there are answers about the Olmeca. But what we do know is that there's evidence that they had a writing system, contrary to what Europeans try to argue that the indigenous people were ahistorical, they had no concept of history. That's just absolutely not true. We do know that they cared about their history, that they even wrote it down. Okay, moving right along, we get to Teotihuacan. And Teotihuacan is a definite tourist destination. It is about I think an hour or so bus ride outside of Mexico City. And unfortunately, a lot of tourists make the mistake when they arrive at Teotihuacan. They think that this was actually built by the Aztecs. And as you can tell by the timeline, this was way before the Mexica. And which, by the way, you'll hear me use Mexica more than Aztec because, just to honor the choice that they picked to identify themselves. All right, so Teotihuacan, often referred to as City of the Gods, was actually just found by the Mexica. When the Mexica arrived in the Valley of Mexico, they found these abandoned temples, and they thought of it as very sacred. They thought of it as the home of their ancestors. What many scholars know happened, but we don't know exactly when, is that, and obviously we see here is there is a shift from what they tried to argue are nomadic people, right? That's the whole Bering Strait argument. These people were nomads, and that's why they were constantly traveling. They had to hunt for their food, where we see strong evidence of sedentary life, right? Or people being city dwellers, staying in one place. And largely it's because of what we know one of the contributions out of Mexico, Mesoamerica, is contributions in terms of agricultural development. And Mesoamerica really, the way you learn about this typically in traditional classes is that there was an agricultural revolution that transformed the world, where people began to be more into farming and less into hunting. How and where that happened, we don't know exactly, but it is often believed that these initial discoveries not necessarily happened because of Teotihuacan, but happened around that time. At least that's the guess. It is believed that it was the women that made this discovery. And you might be wondering, why the women? Well, they're the smarter of the two sexes. No, I'm just kidding. It actually had to do with the division of labor, that women were the gatherers, men were the hunters, and that as women gathered up fruits and berries and nuts and things, that they dropped some seeds into the ground, and they eventually figured out which ones they could eat, which ones were poisonous. And then and from this they discovered this idea of growing your own food. And really what we saw throughout Mesoamerica, and the reason why it's called a revolution, is it revolutionized how people lived. All of a sudden you could cultivate the earth and not worry about surviving through whatever you could kill. And of course the main staple of food in Mesoamerica, you might remember, is maize. Actually, I remember learning it in 8th grade. Maize, the teacher called it, but I know that as maize, right? That main staple. And then, of course, all these contributions of indigenous foods, right? Maize, beans, squash, chiles, peanuts, potatoes, avocados, chocolate, right? Tomatoes, something called chicle, which is gum. Nopales, which is cactus. I don't know if you've ever had cactus before, but nopales are very good for you. All right. And then in terms of meats, really it was very limited and it only included small game like maybe turkey, rabbit, or fish. Um, and so what we see with this agricultural revolution, and of course with the beans and the corn, the invention of the taco, right? Great moment in Chicano history, by the way. um, and of course with the chiles and the tomatoes, the invention of salsa. Another great moment in Chicano history. Um, Quick side note, by the way, I don't know if you're aware of this, but salsa has passed ketchup as the number one condiment used in the United States. So there it is. Another great moment in Chicano history. Obviously, when you think of Mexican cuisine, a lot of those foods come from these basic foods, right? And a lot of it back then, a lot of them just grew wildly. A lot of them people began to plant, of course. This was a photograph of an old cactus nopal that I saw in front of this Temple of the Sun over there. But thinking about the food contributions to the world that came from Mesoamerica, the main staple, of course, corn. It was a lot of varieties of these foods. We have a tendency to just think, oh, the yellow corn, the white corn, right? But there was such a richness in the diversity of corn coming out of Mesoamerica. And now, by the way, scientists have discovered that there's also a lot of important nutritional properties and even medicinal properties in some of these other types of corn. For example, blue corn. Blue corn has been found to actually help in combating diabetes, for example. And the indigenous diet was a very healthy diet, They didn't eat things like chorizo and chicharrones and carnitas and, and they didn't eat, the flour tortillas, which we know are not as healthy as the corn. And the reason, of course, because there were no cows, no pigs, and no wheat over here, right? As a matter of fact, many scholars have now found that the indigenous diet was very, very healthy, so much that it's one thing we need to go back to. There's a great book I'd recommend, by the way, that's called Decolonize Your Diet, which is all about going back to the indigenous foods. One of the things I've been saying for a long time, and it was recently confirmed by the World Health Organization, is that if you look at the afflictions in Latino populations of the United States, a lot of the things that are going wrong with our health are as a result of the introduction of European foods into our diets. And Mexican immigrants, for example, that come from Mexico, especially those that come from rural and poor areas, the longer they're in the United States, the worse their health gets. They're actually healthier when they arrive and their health deteriorates. And many people believe, of course, when they arrive here, they they discover the drive-through, right? And all of the sort of saturated fats in the foods that we eat here in the United States. But if you were to think about the indigenous diet, it was a very healthy diet. And there actually exists what we have come to learn as the 7 warrior foods. So, and scientists have discovered that if you were to shift your diet and just eat these 7 foods, that is a very well-balanced nutritional diet that is basically all that your body needs. So write them down, learn them, and in case you're familiar with corn. Now keep in mind, though, we have to make sure how you prepare them, right? So a lot of people like to eat elotes, right? Corn on the cob, and they'll put, crema and, cheese and all these other things, right? Then you've killed it. You've killed the health nutritional properties of it. So try to not just eat the yellow and white corn, but blue, red corn, all those corns are good for you. Squash, chiles. Of course, chiles we know are high in like vitamin D, and they're also good for your metabolism. Not to mention if your nose is stuffed up, and it's great for sinus problems. Okay, nopales, very nutritious for us. Chia seeds, yeah, like chia plants, the chia seeds, if you might have, I know a lot of people now buying them, putting them, you could put like a spoonful in your water, and they kind of become like jelly-like, but those are really, omega-3s are very high in that, and very healthy. Amaranth. Amaranth was actually known to the Mexica as Huahuautli, and it was thought to have represented up to 80% of their energy consumption. And to this day, amaranth grains are toasted, kind of like what we do with popcorn, and they're mixed with honey or molasses, and they're very healthy for you. Okay. All right, beans, the beans, the frijoles. Now, the same thing like with the corn. Okay, you want to eat the beans straight out of la olla, right? The whole beans. Refried beans, you've just killed it, right? People cook beans, they throw manteca in there, lots of lard, and that's not going to do it. But in the in Mesoamerica, it was a variety of beans, and the healthiest beans, by the way, are the black beans. The highest in the proteins needed in our bodies. So there you have it. Okay, so let's decolonize our diets and turn to our indigenous ancestors because they were onto something. Okay. Now, as they became more sedentary and devoted their lives to growing their food, I don't know if any of you have ever planted a vegetable garden, but farming takes time, and it puts a lot of time on your hands because you have to wait for your plants to grow, right? You can take care of them, but you also have to do a lot of waiting. And this is why people believe that in Mesoamerica there was so much time and energy spent on thinking and understanding how things worked. So we could call that, I guess, sociocultural development, right? And one of the things they paid attention to, they were very observant on how all this great food was coming to us, right? They looked at the seeds they planted into the grounds and noticed that, hey, when I plant them outside, it grows better than when I plant it inside my little hut. Maybe it has something to do with that big bright thing in the sky. When I plant where it's dry, it doesn't grow like when the ground is moist. So maybe that wet stuff that falls. And they began to observe the natural world and realize, hey, all this great food we're getting is related to all these natural occurrences that are happening, like the sun and the rains. And they said, we better hope these things keep happening. They didn't take it for granted that the sun is going to come up. Kind of like we in our Western world tend to kind of take it for granted. And we get annoyed. Oh my God, it's raining. I'm going to get wet. But yet, where would we be without these things like the rain and the sun, right? So before they planted, maybe somebody came out like a shaman priest and blessed the grounds and hoped that this happens again. People began to have time on their hands so they could accumulate things like family possessions and permanent residences. You could fortify your home. You could develop community. People began to rely on each other to help construct their homes and their communities. And in Teotihuacan, for example, that's a major city-state. We know they built temple centers, right? A place to go and pray. And it's right around this time we see the emergence of this idea of duality or dualism, what Carrasco refers to in the ancient word ometeo. Ometeo is a very important idea. Hint, hint. Basically, it's the idea of religious understanding of coexistence, that everything in the world coexists with each other. So if you think about, for example, they observed that, human life is based on coexistence, right? Human survival is based on two key ingredients, man and woman. And you can't have one without the other. And so our human existence is based on coexistence. And then they observe that the same thing applies to the natural world around us, right? All living things kind of coexist with each other. We coexist with the other living things. We coexist with the earth. The earth coexists with the sun and the moon, and everything seems balanced, right? We have half the time we have the sun, the other half the time we have the moon. There's a coexistence there. There's a coexistence with the life cycle. We have life and then we have death, right? This is ometeo, the understanding that everything is balanced and that we have an obligation as human beings to understand that and to coexist and to not disrupt that balance. So this is what Carrasco refers to in his readings when he's talking about things like world making, world centering, and world renewing. Be sure you read that section in Carrasco's book, Religions of Mesoamerica. World making, world centering, and world renewing, because this has a lot to do with this idea of ometeo, that human beings had to work on centering the universe, and that our daily activities were all about maintaining this coexistence. Even if you look at the city of Teotihuacan, right, the whole city is built in accordance with the rising and the setting of the sun. Now you might be wondering, okay, Ometeo, whatever, big deal. But let's stop and think about this for a minute. Is this idea of duality similar or different from our Western European world? Right? If you look at the world we live in today, are we paying attention to coexistence or are we not? Many have argued that we're in a lot of trouble because we're not paying attention to how the need to coexist. If you look at the life and death in the Western European world, we value life, but how do we feel about getting old and dying? Well, we don't want to think about it, right? We want to preserve being young, whether it's using more oil of Olay, plastic surgeries, right? We value being young, and what do we do with old people? We put them in rest homes, right? Old people, you're in the way, you move too slow, get out of the way, right? And what about dying? We don't want to talk about dying, right? We don't want to talk about the fact that we're all headed in the same direction. In our Western European world that we live in today, there's a tendency to ignore the idea of our mortality and the idea that death is a natural thing that's going to happen to all of us. We fear death, right? We go around scaring each other. We think about death like, with Halloween, right? Boo, right? We were afraid of death. In ancient Mexico, it's very different. They accepted life. They celebrated life. But coexistence, ometeo, right? It says you got to accept both. You can embrace the idea of life, but you also have to accept and embrace the idea of death. And as a matter of fact, in Mesoamerica, they celebrated death. Not like we do. Okay, they had something called, you might have heard of Dia de los Muertos, right? Day of the Dead is an ancient celebration that began in Mesoamerica. And it's not a mournful occasion to be sad and to cry, right? Many of you may have seen the way it's celebrated with the building of altares, right? The altars. You see the calaveras, right? The skulls, the sugar skulls, people dressed as skeletons and dancing around because the idea is death is not something to be afraid of. One thing that they had in common with us in the Christian world is that they also believed in heaven, that your soul went to a better place. But they really believed it. Like in our world, many Christians believe in the afterlife, but then they still fear dying. And in Mesoamerica, they didn't trip, right? They were like, hey, if your soul goes to a better place, then why are you tripping about dying? And so, when somebody was going to die, it was like, hey, you're lucky, have a great trip. You're going to the next world. It's much better than our world. So, the more you stop and think about this idea of ometeo, the more you will perhaps think that they understood some things that and they thought about the world in a different way. Their worldview was about balance and maintaining the balance. It exists with men and women, and it exists in the natural world, and even in things that they made and created, like these artifacts. They wanted to make sure to remind themselves of what's important, that human beings should not disrupt the world we live in. Everything from, like, for example, let's see, what else is coexistence? Well, if you take, you also have to give, right? Give and take. So if you pulled a plant from its roots, well, you got to plant one in its place. That's ometeo, right? In our Western European world, we take, but then we take more, we take more, we take more. And then we take everything we have, we go and take what other people have. And it's really throwing us out of balance. Our entire planet is thrown off balance, right? It's pretty much, most scientists now are all in agreement that at the rate of consumption that we have on our planet, we would need 5 Earths to sustain us. And we only have one. So, but we don't want to change our ways. We want to continue to consume at these ever accelerating rates. And many scientists are saying, like, we're like a fast moving train heading for a cliff, nobody wants to hit the brakes. And so did people in Mesoamerica have advanced knowledge? Did they understand the world beyond what we've been taught through Disney and popular culture. And as you explore the readings, you'll find that they had a very deep and sophisticated understanding. Okay, so let's move on. Here's a couple more images. So this is actually a photograph I took of the Temple of the Moon that you see there, but I was standing on top of the Temple of the Sun. So they had one for the moon, one for the sun, part of coexistence. And yeah, it was a photo that I took probably after about 20 minutes of catching my breath climbing up that big temple. Some more images here. Of course, Teotihuacan also amazes us as far as the architectural alignments, the archaeoastronomy that we talked of, right? Here's a couple more images. Again, very advanced architecture. The image on the right shows us, the construction that had an infrastructure of wood. If you look at the ceiling there, right, where it's been cut out so you could see the infrastructure. Okay. A lot of the temples in many of the sites in Mesoamerica have been excavated, and we have found artifacts that you could call ofrendas, right, offerings that were taken to the temples. So if you got to give something, right? So people made things. We also see in Mesoamerica the emergence of religious gods, right? Quetzalcoatl, probably the most notable. You might have heard of the feathered serpent god. And this deity is probably known as like the god of the Americas. If you go downtown San Jose at Cesar Chavez Park, you will see there's like a coiled up serpent on one end of the park there. That's Quetzalcoatl. That's the feathered serpent god, and it is an important reference to this ancient god in Mesoamerica. Now, one thing to be aware of is that in Mesoamerica there was a belief in various deities, but unfortunately, a lot of European scholars have often talked very negatively about the religions that existed in Mesoamerica. A lot of books, for example, do a poor job of contextualizing the European perspective. I'm sorry, I've got a phone call here. The European textbooks oftentimes demonize the idea of religious thinking in Mesoamerica. The way in which they've often written about it is a very judgmental way. Like the Mesoamericans believed in many gods. We all know there's only one. That kind of sort of judgments. And the truth of the matter is that there's been a lot of misunderstandings. I was there at San Jose when they built the statue there, the Quetzalcoatl statue, and they unveiled it, and there was people protesting. Oh, he's a evil god, and all these kinds of And if you read Carrasco, he describes Quetzalcoatl as actually a peace-loving god in all the descriptions we know. But because in Mesoamerica, there was just a deeper understanding. So let's take, for example, the word Quetzalcoatl. That's a Nahuatl word of the Mexica. The first half, Quetzal, is the name of a bird, a very colorful bird with a long plumed tail that lives in that part of the world, Mesoamerica. Quetzaldo, the birds are also symbols of the sky because that's where they live. Goat, the second half of that word, is a representation of serpents and snakes. Okay, now where do they live? On the earth. So serpents and snakes in Mesoamerica are symbolic of the earth. So there you have earth and sky, right? That's also a reference to duality, coexistence. Unfortunately, when Europeans arrived, they saw these references to serpents and snakes, and they associated them with evil, demonic forces. They didn't arrive here. People like Cortez didn't arrive here and say, okay, let's see why they carved these things that look like snakes. Let's find out what people in Mesoamerica think and what they mean, right? They didn't do that. They left their European goggles on, right, looking at the world through European lenses, and they saw that serpents and snakes in Europe are associated with demonic, evil forces. And so they concluded, oh, these people must be evil, right? And so part of the conquest was justified now by demonizing the religions, right? Many gods, and they're just completely, um, you know, barbaric people, right? Um, Now we have to put it in context, though, because maybe the word God is not the right word for us to use to describe what they thought and believed in. If you think about people who are Christian today, like Catholics especially, right? When you go to church, you pray to the Father, you pray to the Son, you pray to the Holy Spirit, and you got this, how many saints, like dozens of saints or whatever. So how many gods do you believe in, right? Of course, you all will say, well, that's only one, right? But you have all these multiple things that you then say add up to one. Maybe we're misunderstanding, right? Just like people could easily misunderstand Christianity. Maybe we're misunderstanding their religion in Mesoamerica. One of the ways I like to describe it is maybe we shouldn't even use the word God. They believe that everything that occurred in the natural world, like the sun, the moon, the rain, the wind, all these things didn't happen by accident. They had some force, some energy that was behind them. Okay. And they all work together to create our one reality, right? Just like your Father, your Son, and your Holy Spirit. Same thing. The sun and the moon, they work together, right? And the rains and the wind kind of works together. So I encourage you to kind of, if you really want to understand Mesoamerica, to step out of our European shoes and try to understand from within their world. Because if you don't, you'll maybe go down the road that Cortez did and end up with misinterpretations. All right. With that said, let's talk about my favorite group, the Maya. All right. Known for their writing system, astronomy, architecture, and sports. This temple right here is in Chichen Itza in the Yucatan, and it's one of the 7 wonders of the world because of its design and how it was constructed. The staircase you see in the picture, there's a staircase on all 4 sides. You add them up, you get 364. With the top, of course, be 365, the same as the calendar of our solar calendar year. There's a lot of mysteries, including the fact that every year during the equinoxes, the sun will shine, casting down a shadow of what many believe to be Quetzalcoatl, or Kukulkan in the Mayan word, kind of cascading down the side of the temple. And this temple of Kukulkan, like I said, got that designation as one of the 7 wonders of the world. And it's an amazing thing to go see if you ever get a chance. It's in the near Cancun, the resort. But this is the city known as Chichen Itza. Very cool place. All right, let's start with the writing system. The Mayans had a very sophisticated writing system that we're still trying to understand today. Read Carrasco's descriptions if you haven't already. He talks about a Mexican journalist that went to Europe because, well, the Mayans had like libraries full of these fold-out manuscripts that we call codices. And when Europeans arrived, they couldn't read them, so they just destroyed them. They burned them. And literally, in Mesoamerica, we know that there were libraries of these manuscripts that were torched in big bonfires. And of the Mayan codices, there's only 4 that remain, and those were all taken to Europe. And Carrasco tells a really cool story about a Mexican journalist or scholar that went over there and got permission to view one of the codices. And he smuggled it out of Europe, out of this museum, and took it to Mexico. I love the story because it's like a story of literally taking back the history, right? As Europeans came and they plundered and they took this important knowledge away, right? So I think the German government demanded that Mexico return the this ancient manuscript, but Mexico refused, and so I think it's still in Mexico now. But many would say it's in its rightful place now. We know that they documented their history. We know they wrote important mathematical calculations. We know that they were able to predict astronomical events like lunar eclipses. They were able to forecast them hundreds of years into the future. We know that the Mayans had a calendar system. They had 3 calendar systems. If you read in Carrasco, they had a long count, and they had a way of counting in large chunks of time. And in another video, I'll try to show you what I'm talking about in terms of the 52-year cycles of time. Back in 2012, you might remember people were trying to predict that the end of the world was coming because of the Mayans' prophecy. And then the next day people woke up and said, oh, I guess we can all climb out from under our bed and we're all still here, and the Mayans had it wrong. But again, that's popular culture. That's European, misinterpretation. The Mayans were not predicting the end of the world, but more so that the end of a 52-year cycle was going to bring about change. And on that front, you could make an argument that they were accurate in their prediction of change. If you look at the world that we're living in today, we have environmental change, we have social and political and economic change. All right. This structure here is believed to have been an observatory. We know they were astronomers. They kept track of the planet Venus. They knew of the planet Mars, and they even knew about the calendar of Mars. How they knew that is beyond me. All right. Architecture. Notice that some of the rocks here are different from the ones we saw at Teotihuacan. These are limestone. And it's kind of a chalky rock, and a lot of the temples there in the Yucatan are constructed out of limestone. All right, moving on. The Mayans actually had a game. It's kind of like a cross between soccer and basketball. Okay, so there is your field, like in soccer, and there's the hoop. Okay, their game, either Olamalitzli, sometimes called Ulama, there's different names for it, because these ball courts appear in different places in Mesoamerica. The problem is we don't know exactly what they meant, what they were for. Was it just for entertainment? Did city-states compete against each other and have like a big World Cup at the end? We're not sure, but we know it was an important game. And the way it was played is you had to put the ball through the hoop, but you couldn't use your feet, or you couldn't use your hands or your feet, right? So, how did you hit the ball? Well, they hit it with their hips. And so as you can imagine, it's a very low scoring game. Some have tried to spin the meaning into a religious kind of interpretation, that part of the object of the game is keep the ball in constant motion. Others mostly European scholars, have tried to spin it as this was a military war game and the losers were killed. And the truth is, we don't really know. There's a lot of debate over this, but nonetheless, we know that these games existed. All right, the last group up, the Chichimecas. They entered into the Valley of Mexico from a place north. Their homeland's up north. It was referred to back then as Aztlan, and we'll talk more about Aztlan as we go forward, but it became an important kind of place of their origin. Some have come to believe it was somewhere here in the southwestern United States. The first subgroup of Chichimecas was the Toltecs, that entered the Valley of Mexico and settled and established the city of Tula in 968 AD. And then the last migration of Chichimecas were this group known as the Mexica. And they established the city of Tenochtitlan. And, by the time of the arrival of the Mexica, a lot of the prime real estate was taken up. And they had to really fight to get a foothold in the Valley of Mexico. And it probably wasn't till about the 1300s that they really got a stronghold. But once they did, watch out, because the Mexica became one of the most powerful groups in all of Mesoamerica. And of course, the last of the powerful empires before the Spanish conquest. And this next image is a mural painted by a famous Mexican painter, Diego Rivera, who tried to do a painting to depict what the capital city of the Mexica, this city known as Tenochtitlan, what it may have looked like at its peak. Now we know at the peak of their civilization, the Mexica governed an expansive geographic area, and they ruled over well over 1 million people. Okay, so definitely a group to be reckoned with, and one of the groups that in the next lecture we're going to spend a lot more time learning about and understanding. So for the next lecture, be sure you read the chapter in Carrasco and in Acuña on the Mexica, so that you'll be prepared for that conversation. All right, so this concludes that lecture.